Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And it's also a great treat to be able to do this presentation with two of our wonderful volunteers who are in Geneva with us. I think that what I will do right now is just give you a little bit of an introduction, and then the format for the rest of the evening is going to be more of a Q&A style, so a little bit more conversation with Karen and Mark, and we're a small enough group that you can certainly jump in and ask questions as well. But if we could go to the next slide, I will just tell you a little bit about the Advocates for Human Rights. So we are an international human rights organization based here in Minneapolis. We do work in the United States, in Minnesota, and in our region. We do a lot of work representing asylum seekers. We serve 700, 800 clients a year, actually, and have about 200 volunteer attorneys who are representing those individuals. We also do a lot of anti-trafficking work locally, and education work as well in the schools and in community events like this. Internationally, we do work on women's human rights issues. So actually, two of our staff are on a plane right now on their way to Bulgaria, where they'll be training 16 women's rights activists from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet countries on things like advocacy at the United Nations. And we also do, through our international justice program, we do work at the United Nations, and our goal is really to take human rights issues and problems with the implementation of laws that should be protecting human rights, to take that information and work with our partners to bring that up to the international community. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And just for future reference, when we talk about the Serpentine Lounge, this is the Serpentine Lounge. So can we go to the next slide, please? So the Advocates has something called special consultative status with the United Nations. And what that allows us to do is to participate in the human rights mechanisms at the UN in Geneva. And you know, the United Nations is it's a massive organization, right? It's huge, but the human rights mechanisms are a little bit they're a little bit more concrete and very issue focused, and they, for the most part, meet in Geneva. Occasionally, there are meetings in the New York office, but almost all of them are in the Palais des Nations in Geneva, which was built for the League of Nations, and unfortunately the League of Nations dissolved before they were ever had the opportunity to meet there. But it's have any of you been to the UN office in Geneva? Okay, so compared to the UN office in New York, it's quite a different kind of building and a different feeling. But special consultative status allows us to participate in the meetings of the mechanisms and to participate in interactive dialogues on certain issues. So we'll talk about oral statements in a little bit. But we also have a special credentialing process. So this is just a photo of the security gate as we're getting ready to get our UN credentials. We are a non-governmental organization, or NGO in UN speak. So just to very briefly give you an overview of the UN human rights system, we'll go into it more in depth in the questions, but I think it's helpful to just understand that within the UN human rights system, there are kind of two different channels or two different kinds of human rights bodies. And one is the treaty-based bodies. So what that means is that they derive their power from multilateral treaties, human rights treaties. The US has ratified a handful of, or has ratified 4 of the human rights treaties, but there are more. There's about 9. There are 2 big ones. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the second is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then the other the other treaties deal with specific things, like there's the Convention Against Torture, there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So they're very topic specific. The most recent one is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So those treaties, so to be reviewed by the treaty monitoring bodies of those mechanisms, a country has to have signed on to the treaty and ratified the treaty. And once they do ratify, then they have to make regular reports to the committee. And the committees are independent experts. They're appointed to be committee members. There's sort of geographical regional representation from around the world. But they basically serve in this role of reviewing how a country's record, like their human rights record, and how they comply with the treaty. The way that non-governmental organizations and civil society can contribute to that is to submit shadow reports or parallel reports. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that, more about that later, but that's one of the ways that we are involved with the treaty bodies. On the other side, and actually in a different building, is the charter-based mechanisms. So these are human rights mechanisms that draw their power from the UN Charter itself. So if you're a member of the United Nations, then you would be, you have to go through the Universal Periodic Review process of the Human Rights Council. So every member state of the United Nations has to every 4.5 years have their record reviewed by their peers in the Human Rights Council. And there's no sort of issue-specific kinds of rights. It's every kind of human rights. So it's a much broader review. And there are opportunities for NGOs like the Advocates to participate and engage with the Human Rights Council by making written submissions on for those country reviews, and then also to meet with the Human Rights Council delegates and encourage them, educate them about the issues, and encourage them to make the recommendations that we would like them to. And then there's also, within the Human Rights Council, there are some other activities that they can do and independent experts that they can assign. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. So maybe we can go to the next slide. And I'll just tell you very briefly about what Mark and Karen and I and our team were doing in Geneva. So here's we were actually in Geneva for 2 weeks in March at the Human Rights Council session there. This was the team our second week. And we had volunteers, in addition to Karen and Mark, we had volunteers coming from Washington, D.C. and Birmingham, Alabama, and several staff members. And another volunteer from California. The week before, we had a volunteer from Chicago. So it's people coming, are volunteers around the country, but we're all together in Geneva. We also bring partner organizations with us. So we've worked with them together on written submissions to the UN, and then are doing joint lobbying there. So on the far right is Jerome Lottering, who is a human rights activist from South Africa. And then Anya is next to him, and she is a women's rights activist from Poland. So it's a great opportunity for us to work side by side and build their capacity to do this kind of advocacy. And it's also really important to involve our partners, because they go back to their home countries and then continue the advocacy. And we'll talk some more about that as we move forward. We usually are also, when we're on one of these trips, we're usually engaging at the Human Rights Council and also with a treaty body. We try to time it so that there's a treaty body review going on, so that our volunteers have a chance to see those two different kinds of human rights mechanisms. We also do side events, which are presentations, and often we'll participate in the interactive dialogues and make oral statements before the Human Rights Council. So that's a little bit of an overview, and I'm going to sit back down at the table, and we're going to start our Q&A. But I guess maybe I'll just see if, are there any questions so far? Or should we just forge ahead? Okay. So I will, whoops, I'm going to bring this. Okay. So the first question is for Karen. So you were part of the delegation in March of 2017.
Right.
Can you just give us a description of what the week was like, what you did, what the week involved?
Yep, sure, of course. So to start with, before I left in March, we had 2 meetings, and Jennifer and maybe some others from the Advocates put together this notebook with all kinds of fantastic information for us. It's a little overwhelming when you read it all and you're digesting all of this information as to how everything works, but it's really helpful because when you get there, then you see how it all plays out. It all starts to make a lot of sense. So.
Can I just mention that the microphone you got is great. It ties right into the camera, but
This one.
It's not really magnifying for us.
Yep.
Yeah, you can just leave that on the,
Okay.
I think that's.
Okay.
that
Yeah,
works.
okay.
Great.
Perfect, thank you.
Can we go to the next slide? Maybe,
Okay,
when you
so
have a chance?
everybody was there. Most people came on Saturday of the second group, and then on Sunday we had a debriefing and got together and just talked about what the week was going to be like and how we were going to get badged the first day and then what the procedures would be. So we stayed at a hotel that was quite close to the UN. A nice hotel, not super expensive, but very clean and nice people ran it and a good breakfast and everything. So you could either walk up to the UN, some of us did, or there was a tram that also went up if you didn't want to walk. So we started on Monday morning getting badged. The Human Rights Council, I think they begin at 9 and they go straight through to 6 without really any break at all. So we tried to be there by 9. First day probably was a little later than that by the time we all got badged. And then we would go, Advocates had an amazing, they had cards that they had done that had each country on it, where they were sitting in the UN. We had a seating map, so we knew where everybody was. And then we would take the card. We knew what things they had advocated for in the past and where they might help us when these countries came up for the Universal Periodic Review. So we would just go down into the UN Council. I could see that somebody from Zambia was there, or, and just tap them on the shoulder. We wanted to talk to them, say, I've expressed an interest in human rights in Morocco and Tunisia and whatever, and we have information we would love, explain who we are, first of all. But then we have information we would love to share with them, and would they be willing to meet with us in the Serpentine Lounge over the course of the next few days. And so hopefully you get an appointment with them, and then, so it'd be that day later or the next day or whatever, and then, so if it was someone that I had met, that I had came, then I would be there, and always someone from the Advocates, because they know a lot more than the volunteers, and mostly you're doing the speaking. So that went on for 4 days. Friday was sort of a wrap up some things, and a lot of people were leaving by then, or a few people went up. And then there were also these side events that I'm not going to talk about now because we'll talk about that later, but side events and opportunities to do other things. So it was a busy week. And then we would have debriefings. So it ends at 6. So we would have a debriefing, let's say 6:30, usually at a room just right around the UN Human Rights Council where we were working. And then we would go back to the hotel and then go out for dinner. So there were 15 of us. So I started making dinner reservations because you could see when you walk into a restaurant that's sort of small and you've got maybe not always 15, but for sure at least 10, they're kind of going, oh my gosh. So anyway, so the days were pretty long, but very fulfilling and really wonderful. So.
Yeah, great. And this is just a photo of the Sunday training. This is a model now we've done 3 or 4 times with having this week, and it is a very intense week, which is why the Friday has become optional, because we have people come on Saturday and then spend most of Sunday training and then just hit the ground running on Monday. But let me just ask you, Mark, what drew you to volunteer for this mission?
Well, what drew me to volunteer was that I had been active with the Advocates since 2010. And there were some things that over at Thomson Reuters that started to develop, One was I wanted to get the attorneys over at Thomson Reuters involved with the advocates. I thought that we have all these attorneys. They're not volunteering that much. Yes?
Hold the microphone a little.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Also, I was doing something over at, I was part of a research group over at Thomson Reuters, and we were looking at the Universal Periodic Review from the United Nations. And this actually was a foundation for the Advocates program. At the time, I didn't know that. I was just creating a spreadsheet. And it was like, okay, I'm making this up. What's happening with this? And then we were also trying to start up our pro bono program over at Thomson Reuters. So I thought, well, if I go on this program, I can get the other attorneys to be wowed about this program and start doing pro bono work.
And same question for you, Karen.
Okay, so I had done some work with the advocates since like the late 90s, but just somewhat with Robin Phillips when she became executive director. I did employment law, so I was helping her with a few things here and there, and we're good friends. And I had done little things here and there, but I'd never been on a trip, and I'd never been involved in this depth. And so I knew that this was a possibility. I'd not been able to do it a couple of years in the past because of other conflicts, and this year I'm going like, I'm making this work. So, so that was, it was fantastic.
Great. And how did your expectations compare to the experience?
Better. I mean, it was wonderful. I think if you get there, you have all this material and it's a little confusing as to how it all works. And but then as soon as you see it and you see the seating chart and you see the people and you get a sense of the geography, if you will, of the area, and when you get one person who's willing to come and talk to you, the whole process starts to make a whole lot of sense. So it was wonderful. It was better than I knew it'd be good. It was great.
Same question?
Same question, yeah.
I was surprised by all the activity that was going on in Geneva. I was also surprised about the security badges. We have security badges at Thomson Reuters. You're supposed to wear them. People don't wear them. Or they do wear them, but it doesn't have to be prominent all the time. When you're going up into the United Nations Council room, you have to wear that badge. They might know you, but if you're not wearing the badge, they turn you away. The amount of knowledge that you would gain from this, the binder is what I was going to show, but Karen already did that. And the other thing that was surprising was that Geneva hasn't changed. I went on a tour with Jennifer, and she was talking about how all the landmarks hadn't changed. In the Twin Cities, in the United States, we tear things down, we build them back up. Over there, they did not change. There's a restaurant that 20 years ago my brother went to, Le Pied du Cochon. It's pig's feet. And he was asking, is it still there? It was. So it was really cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll just add that I spent 2 summers in Geneva when I was in law school, one working for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and one working for what was the predecessor to the Human Rights Council. It was the Human Rights Commission. And it still surprises me when I go back there. Sometimes there's a new restaurant or a new building, but it's very, very much the same as it was, 20 years ago. Was there a question over there? Or just somebody stretching? Sorry. Okay. And Mark, I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball. We sort of talked through what the questions that we would ask, but I'm going to ask Mark one that's not on the list.
Darn.
Because why don't you talk a little bit about the kinds of things that you did volunteering that were maybe a little unique, like the translations and.
Oh. Do you mean while I was there or previous?
Both. Yeah.
Well, when I started out with the Advocates, I did something called inline editing for a director. I can't remember her name offhand, but I then thought, well, can I do something with my foreign languages? So I searched their webpage and I came across a volunteer translator. I didn't know what the difference was between a translator and an interpreter was. I was terrified. But I thought, well, all I can say is I can't do it. So I applied. They started sending me requests. Can you do a translation of a birth certificate or a death certificate or an affidavit, a flyer, a website? And for 2 years, I just went, okay, I'm taking it. And it was in French and it was in Spanish, going from English to Spanish, English into French, French to English, Spanish to English. And I did that for a while. And in 2014, the Advocates honored me with a volunteer award. And then prior to this, to the trip, we had to do one-pagers. It's a sort of a synopsis of what the countries are looking for in regards to the issues that affect them. And there were 2 countries. There was Morocco and Tunisia. Morocco was just a complete translation into French. Tunisia was write up a one-pager, then translate it. So that's what I did. It was a lot of fun, but it was a lot more fun talking to the people in French.
Yeah, so every one of our volunteers brings their own special gifts, and so we were really, it was great to have Mark, who could do both the, translating the advocacy pieces that we were then using to talk to the Human Rights Council delegates, but then sometimes it was like, Mark, go talk to Spain and see if they can, or go talk to, Zambia or Cameroon, and
That was fun.
it made it a great deal. And as Karen said, just helping with the logistics of managing this group was a huge help as well. So all of our volunteers contributed in special ways that maybe they didn't expect to. Okay, well, let's shift a little bit and talk about one of the things that we did, which was hosting side events. And let's see, Karen, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what a side event is and what we are trying to do with side events.
Okay.
And we can go to the next slide for a photo.
The side events focus on generally one issue. So the week that Mark and I were there were 2 side events. The week before, there was 1 side event. Both of the side events that Mark and I were at were in partnership with in one case, the woman came from Poland, and the other case, the man who came from South Africa, so partners on the ground. We're in smaller rooms in the Palais Nation, so we give this to people that we specifically want to come. It's open to anybody, but there are some we know will have more interest than others. So it tells when the side events are, what they include, the time and everything like that. And they last for about an hour and a half here. So the first one was on violence against women, dealing with Colombia, where we had one of our volunteers had been in Colombia for a couple of years doing a lot of research, Montenegro, Poland, where we had the volunteer, and Serbia. So we're just providing in-depth information for people. It's a forum sort of like this, people around a big table or in a semicircle, you can ask questions. The second one was human rights in South Africa, focusing on the violation of the rights of the colored people, and Jerome was a colored person. So, and there was also one of the volunteers had done a film on living in Africa as a colored person. And so we were able to view a little bit of the film, and then Jerome spoke as well. It was very compelling. So again, people had this if they wanted to come, and both were well attended and really provided much more information than they would have gotten in any other setting.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and so for Montenegro and Serbia, the Advocates has just published reports on documentation, human rights fact-finding reports on violence against women in those countries. So we were able to talk about those issues as well. So side events are really a great way to kind of just raise awareness about particular issues. Karen mentioned Jerome and the experiences and the violations against the colored people in South Africa. They're mixed race, and so under apartheid they were categorized differently. And so what's happened in the post-apartheid era is that they're not eligible for the affirmative action programs that Black South Africans are, and so they're having a lot of problems with accessing housing and education and so forth. So it's an issue that many people outside of South Africa are not familiar with. So he was really pleased to be able to do this. And there were so the people that come to these are often other NGOs. There's just there's hundreds of people at the UN. but also Human Rights Council delegates, and so representatives of their governments will come, and we had several that came to this particular event.
There's one question back here.
Okay.
Okay, sure.
Well, it's a very elementary question, and I don't want to interrupt your flow. But how do you deal with the obvious tensions, like women's rights are very important from what I've seen here, and Saudi Arabia is not, you know, notorious for being a leader in that, but they're on the Human Rights Council. How do you deal with these obvious contradictions between government policy of the delegates and your missions?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And the question, if in case anybody missed it, was how do we deal with the tensions between you know, the policies of some of the governments that are on the Human Rights Council and what we believe in. So I guess there's a couple of parts to that, and actually I'll take it back a little bit more because I know there's a lot of discourse in the United States about the U.S. role in the Human Rights Council. So that the Human Rights Council itself has a certain number of seats, so you're on the Human Rights Council, but every member of the United States has a seat in that room. And so, you know, you guys were both there too, so you can comment on this as well. But my sense is that everyone has a voice in the debates that are going on, and so it's a little bit, it doesn't really matter that much to say, I mean, there should not be human rights violators on the Human Rights Council, but it has a little bit less of an impact than you would think that it would. The Human Rights Council is a peer-to-peer, it's a peer, so everybody has a seat, they have an equal voice, and so, you know, a lot of the human rights violators end up being smaller just because there's so many voices in the room. Now, the second piece of it is how we deal, you know, how we interact, and so, you know, we don't usually go and talk to the delegate from Saudi Arabia about women's rights, you know, so that's part of the targeting and prioritizing. That it's actually a great segue into the next set of questions. Yes, Joe.
One of the criticisms of the Human Rights Council is that in the 4-yearly periodic review, the country being reviewed can choose the countries that give testimony for or against it. But obviously they choose countries that are favorable to their position, so that it becomes a bit of a charade, these reviews, because they are not really reviews, they're self-congratulatory exercises. And anyway, it's a point that is often overlooked. In other words, they're not objective reviews, and anyway, I'll just let it go at that. There's more I could say on that subject, but really.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, the UN doesn't have any enforcement power. The UN human rights mechanisms have no enforcement power, and so, you know, other than shame and so it does matter, you know, to some countries what their peers are saying. But I do agree that you know, they can reject any of the recommendations and accept the ones that they want. There's kind of no, you know, that's their sovereign right. Yes.
One problem I have is that the United States is never labeled as someone who violates human rights up the wazoo, and I resent that because I know we do.
Yeah,
and
no.
Nobody ever talks about it.
Yeah.
Don't talk to me about other countries that are human rights violators, when the United States government, to me, is one of the greatest violators of human rights that there are.
Yeah. Well, the Advocates we always participate in the U.S. review, and actually it might, you know, restore a little faith for you to know how strongly the U.S. is criticized within the UN, especially on things like the death. So it just doesn't get any media coverage in the U.S.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. So, but it gets a lot of media coverage outside of the U.S. Yes?
Can you expand the areas in which the U.S. is criticized that you heard about?
Sure. The areas where the U.S. receives the most criticism, the death penalty, and all of the problems related to the death penalty, race issues. I'm trying to think now back to so a lot of sort of the immigration, detention, and enforcement kind of issues. Actually, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty is going to be doing a country visit soon to look at the disparities, the economic disparities, and those are all of the Guantanamo and torture and very, very harsh criticism for the U.S. on that.
Is
yes.
the incarceration of the African Americans?
Oh, absolutely. The incarceration of African Americans is very, and the U.S. will be reviewed by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So it's a cycle. It's about a 6-year cycle for the treaty bodies. So that's going to be coming up again. So all of the things that we are critical of our government about, the international. They're hearing about it from the international community. Unfortunately, our government is not too willing to listen to that. Yeah. So, but we'll talk a little bit more about that impact and stuff too as we go forward. Maybe one more question and then we'll
I was just
move
going to
on.
ask, how can we have access to those reports?
Yeah.
What's the best way
Well,
to get that?
they're actually, the U.S. government publishes them on a website, on their own website. So, they are also on the UN website, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So they're all publicly available, but again, just does not get much attention at all in the U.S., which is unfortunate. Okay, well let's shift to talking specifically about the Universal Periodic Review, because we've started touching on it, and maybe we can go to the next slide for that. So the advocates. So this is the Human Rights Council room itself. The members of the Human Rights Council sit in the first couple of rows, and then the rest of the room, most of it is for the other countries, the other Human Rights Council delegates, and then way in the back are the NGO the cheap seats for the non-governmental organizations. The interpreters are in kind of that upstairs. There's a row of glass, and they're interpreting in all 5 languages, so that's a tough job, I have to say. And then when the Universal Periodic Review is happening, the government has to sit up at that front desk and sort of present and take questions from the others. So the beginning of the process is a written submission, and so they're fairly short with a joint stakeholder report. They're about 10 pages or less, so they're usually shorter than what we submit to treaty bodies. Once that the next phase for us is either to try to get that information to the Human Rights Council delegates. So we do that by email. Right now just this afternoon we are emailing our written submissions for the next UPR cycle, so the November cycle. But that's a lot of people. There's 193 member states in the UN, and so if we're thinking about reaching out through email or when we're in Geneva in person, that's a lot of potential people to talk to. So Mark, why don't you tell us how the advocates targets and prioritize the countries that we want to lobby?
This is where Thomson Reuters comes into play. The advocates had come to my company and asked, can you help us with this research project? I believe there were 7 of us that initially started with it. And the advocates came and trained us, but we still had some questions about the process. It was so new to us. There were some acronyms that they had to clarify. Generally, if you want, could you move the slide? I think it's another one. Yes.
Okay.
When a session first starts, when a session starts and ends, I monitor that and I make certain that my team knows, hey, the session's ended, we need to get on board on this. So I send out an email, and I also send out the instructions every single time so that the people know that, and we select which countries we're all going to be doing. We go to a certain website and we access this report. At the end of the report, there are some recommendations from the various countries. My team, we go through the report, all the recommendations, and we fill out a spreadsheet. On one side of the spreadsheet are all the countries that are making the recommendations. And then there are all these different issues that are at the top of the spreadsheet. One is the death penalty, domestic abuse, LGBTI, and HIV. We're trying to mainly find recommendations that support the advocate's position, because we want the people to go talk to these countries and encourage them to continue their support. And if you go, can you go another slide, please? That's the type of recommendations that we find. They're bolded. We have to read them very carefully. There was an occasion where, on occasions we have to contact the advocates because some of the terminology isn't really clear. For instance, this year there was the term extrajudicial killings. And for Venezuela, the advocates decided to include that in the spreadsheet. Well, this year I was looking at the Philippines, and they used this same term, but it wasn't the executive branch that was making these calls of executions. It was the state police, and it was dealing mainly with cocaine.
It was who?
It was the police, and it wasn't the executive branch just saying, "Hey, just do this." It was just their normal routine, and I contacted Amy over at the Advocates, and she looked at it and she said, "No, we're not going to include that." So we compiled this information, and then we let the Advocates know about it, and then they are able to form these cards, and it helps us to target the individual countries. And it's very useful. I didn't know that the spreadsheet was going to be used that way, and it was great.
Yeah, so there's a lot of data that we go through. We're looking at sort of the concluding observations and recommendations from the past UPR cycles. But these are countries, and it's part of their foreign policy, so that's constantly changing as well. And so usually one of the first questions we ask in a lobbying meeting is, what are your country's priorities for this session? And Karen talked a little bit earlier about going up and tapping them on the shoulder. So sometimes we have already done the email outreach and set up meeting. We usually have some meetings already set up, but a lot of the countries, might only have 1 or 2 staff people, especially a lot of the African permanent missions might only have 1 or 2 staff people, and so aren't replying to email, and so you have to go and talk to them. Mark, is there anything else you want to add about how we go about doing the lobbying?
Well, one thing that after we are given the cards, we then look at the entire council room, and we have to find where the delegates are located. The placards are in French, and so that was one thing that some people had to get used to. But you go up, first of all, you go up in escalators, you go through security, you look around, there's a map that helps you to find the delegates, but you also have to go to a specific monitor to see who's actually speaking. Because you don't want to go up to that delegate while he's speaking and suddenly show up on the big screen. And that's actually happened to Jerome. And he looked around, he was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to be here."
Yeah, we cover that in the training.
Yes. But you introduce yourself, you thank them for their positions, and then you start to talk to them and try to encourage them to come to these meetings. So part of it was just setting up the meeting themselves, and then bringing them down to the Serpentine Lounge and elaborating more on the subject matter. I do know that when I talked to the Chinese delegation, they weren't concerned about meeting, mainly because they're so busy. They just said, "Send it by email." Well, even though you were trying to set up these meetings, these delegates are very, very busy. And we had to constantly follow up. Emails, texting them, come down and visit us.
And Karen, why don't you tell us what it's like to actually be in one of those meetings?
Okay, so we're in what we saw earlier, that Serpentine Lounge, and the Advocates has the first 2 tables as you walk into the room, which also has a place to get food and drinks and a wonderful veranda that overlooks Lake Geneva, and it's a beautiful setting. So someone from the Advocates is always there, sometimes 2 people, and the volunteer or the person who got them to come in so that they recognize a face or we could recognize them. And then we just start talking about, what the issues are with certain countries that we know they are probably going to be supportive of. So we give them we call it a one-pager, but it's 2 sides, and then much more in-depth information. But people get so much information. They kind of go through this. It's bulleted. It makes it kind of straightforward and easy. If they want more information, they can go to this. And then sometimes at the end, so this one had six bullets at the recommendations at the very end. They would say, I only have so much time. What are your priorities? I'll take 3. I'll do 3. So then they sometimes actually use our exact words down the line. So, it's just a conversation. It was just interesting. The U.S. delegate came in, not because we were necessarily, just nice to meet her, and she was new to Geneva. It was her first foreign service assignment. She was there with her family. So it was just interesting to get her view on how things were going there. But people were very interested and very appreciative of this information.
Yeah, and the meetings are usually pretty short because they are busy. So we try to get across information, and maybe we can pass around a couple of the one-pagers.
Sure.
I can see. So some of the issues that we were working on this particular trip, I talked about South Africa. We're also, the Advocates is part of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty, so we work with partners who are working for death penalty abolition throughout the world. And so Bahrain was one of the countries that we were working on. And then we have strong partners in the MENA region based in Morocco, but they also work in Tunisia and Libya. And so we've been working on women's rights with them. And so both Morocco and Tunisia were up for review. And then Poland as well. So yeah, and that was women's rights as well. So you'll just see with the one-pagers, this is something we adapted actually from our US-based advocacy to have something that is just, it's technically a 2-pager, but
one piece of paper.
One piece of paper. But it's not something that's very common in Geneva, and so I think people were very excited to be able to have, like the information distilled down. So, Karen, what was the most surprising thing for you about the UPR experience?
I just think how amenable people were to chatting with us and very gracious. I mean, it's also surprising that once in a while someone clearly did not want to make an appointment, and they said they've got to talk to someone from the country or an ambassador or somebody else, and I go back again and say, haven't talked to so-and-so, so you just know that they're not interested in coming out for a meeting. But, yeah, it was just, people were very gracious and interested and friendly and very nice. And it was, it's just incredible to see representatives from all these countries there.
Yeah, Mark, same question for you.
What was, I would say, daunting? I would say the lobbying, I did not feel as if I knew enough, and I was approaching strangers, which I didn't know if they would be interested in what I had to say. But I knew that the advocates were there, but I'm like, oh, they know more than I do. I don't know what I'm talking about, but everyone was very gracious and very receptive, and they were very patient.
Yeah, great. Okay, so maybe can we go back? I think it's 2 slides now. There's a kind of a graph. Yeah, that one. So what we've talked about now is we've talked about number 1, the kind of the preparation that we go through by submitting a written report. After this lobbying, the lobbying is kind of between 1 and 2. 2 is the interactive dialogue, and so we were there in March. The UPR review, actually, the interactive dialogue with the state happened in May. there's not much of a role for NGOs in that. It's a discussion between the country and its peer member states. So we don't usually go to that to the actual UPR. But once so that's usually like it's a 2-day kind of thing, or 2-3-hour sessions, where the government presents its report and then takes these questions and recommendations from its peers. So we're going to show a little clip of that, just so you get a sense of you know, what it looks like. Yeah, why don't we start getting that pulled up. But then after that review, the government has about 6 months to decide whether they want to adopt, or what recommendations they're going to adopt or accept, and then what recommendations they're going to note, which basically means reject. And then most countries have accepted a 2-year midterm review, so they have to come back and report on the recommendations they've accepted. So we're just going to watch a couple minutes of this.
We recommend Poland the following: to adopt a comprehensive strategy aimed at preventing and eliminating all forms of violence against women,
to amend the criminal code to clearly criminalize domestic violence and implement a comprehensive strategy to eliminate all forms of violence against women.
We therefore recommend Poland to continue its good efforts to address violence against women and domestic violence, including by increasing support for victims of domestic violence.
We recommend that Poland intensifies its actions to combat violence against women and to counter discrimination against women.
Poland continues its efforts to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence against women.
Adopt measures to protect women's rights, including strengthening of laws against sexual violence, as well as ensuring equal participation of women in political and public affairs.
Continue its effort to eliminate violence against women, including domestic violence.
Positive, the government recommends Poland to harmonize its national legislation with the provisions of the Istanbul Convention and to continue to promote the participation of women in public and political life of the country.
Australia recommends Morocco amend domestic legislation to remove all forms of gender-based discrimination and protect the rights of women and children.
Belgium recommends, first, that Morocco speed up the adoption of the draft law 103/13 on violence against women, while taking into consideration the need to extend the protection provided for the women's victims of violence, and to criminalize conjugal rape.
To strengthen the legal framework in place to protect women from all forms of violence and to eliminate all gender-based discrimination legislation.
Canada today recommends that Morocco first ensure that the minimum age of marriage is respected at 18, including the right given to judges under Article 20 of the Family Code.
Since the trend of all early marriages in Morocco reaches the overwhelming 99% of girls minors, including those aged 14 to 16, we urge the government to eliminate this harmful practice and raise awareness among public and parents for their effective protection.
Ireland recommends that Morocco revise the penal code and associated law for compliance with international standards, to guarantee equality between men and women, criminalise marital rape, decriminalise sexual relations outside marriage, abolish discrimination against children born outside of marriage, increase the minimum age of marriage to 18, decriminalise consensual same-sex relations, and develop public awareness programs to address stigmatisation of LGBTI persons.
And take steps to further improve the protection of women who are subject to violence, including through amending the penal code to ensure criminalization of marital rape. 2. To take measures to counteract the trend of judicial authorizations of marriages involving minors, including through necessary amendments of the Family Code.
We recommend Morocco to revise the Family Code to prohibit polygamy and marriage of minors, as well as guaranteeing equality between men and women in inheritance matters and in the right to guardianship.
We'll just stop it there. That'll give you at least a little of what a UPR is like. And I guess we'll just have a comment on the impact of this experience, or the impact we've seen in the work that we've done. So I didn't show the Tunisia clip, but Tunisia had a lot of the same issues in Morocco. So you heard the early marriage of girls, polygamy, conjugal rape is a big one. Another one that was in Tunisia, but we've been successful already in getting changed in Morocco, is the provision of law that allows a man who has sexually assaulted a minor, if he marries her, then he's not prosecuted. And so we were a little bit ahead. With Morocco, we went through the same process and got a lot of good recommendations, and Morocco did change their law. Tunisia hadn't changed it yet, it had the same law. So after this experience, Tunisia changed that law. So this was in May, and Tunisia changed their law by July. So that kind of international pressure on a specific kind of legislation can make a difference. We've also had kind of similar experience with countries like Croatia. In Croatia, that's another country where we work on domestic violence and violence against women's issues. And Croatia had, before their UPR, they had decriminalized domestic violence. So domestic violence was a misdemeanor, no longer a felony crime. And same process, lobbying and getting the language in about changing it, about recriminalizing it. And it was so embarrassing that the president took an interest herself in it, and the law was changed back within just a couple of months as well. So we do see, unfortunately we don't see that impact in the US and on our policies, but we definitely see that impact in other countries. So, Mark, how has this experience changed how you view the UN?
Well, back in July 2017, we had a CLE, and Matt pretty much summed it up. Matt was one of the members who was one of the volunteers that came with us, and it was, the little man has a voice at the UN. Through these NGOs, the little man can speak. And for me, my initial response was how fortunate we are in the United States. We have all these liberties.
We have what?
All these liberties. And some of these people in these countries don't. And we take them for granted. When I did my oral statement, I didn't know anything about the Congo. And I started to read about it. And I was totally surprised how one political party would try to wipe out another. I didn't expect that. And it was horrible. I've done some translations where one woman is trying to flee, not gangs, but the police. And their friends are trying to help them get out of the country. I didn't expect that either. You learn a little bit.
So it's just a real education, isn't it? I mean, I think when you read this material and then you actually are there, it's just a different experience to understand that there's 193 countries represented here. And even if some things aren't going to get changed, some things will get changed, and you can't stop. You just have to keep trying. That's what the Advocates does. They make a difference here and there, and they just keep forging ahead. And it was just also really, to me, because I'd been to Geneva a couple times for very short stays, and I had not been to the UN, and took the tour, which was absolutely amazing as a facility and the grounds of it all. And I'd been in New York a couple times at the UN, but never in Geneva. So that was also very impressive to see. It's a picture of all of us there with the flags. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's in this beautiful building in the background. It's impressive. It really is. And you hope that it has, some goodness here for everybody. Clearly that's not the case in all countries, but you do what you can, and little steps along the way.
Yep, I think that's true. Okay, we're going to try to wrap up our talking by about 8:15, so we can make sure we have more time for question. Yeah.
Was there any discussion of the UN ban on nuclear weapons?
So the question was there discussion of the ban on nuclear weapons? There wasn't as part of the meetings that we were participating in, but there's usually so much going on in other parts. So I've definitely seen that on on the schedule many, many times, but I haven't had the opportunity to participate in any of those discussions. I was in Geneva once when the Syrian peace talks were going on, and that was an interesting, just seeing the two, the camps. That was very interesting. Can we go back just one slide? And I want to say just a little bit more about the treaty bodies. So this is the Palais Wilson. This is the building where the treaty monitoring bodies usually meet. It's also where the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is. This is down on the lake, so it's maybe 20 minutes or so from the Palais where the other things are going on. But I just wanted to highlight, again, with the treaties, human rights treaties, the country has to ratify them in order to be reviewed by the committees of independent experts. It is the Human Rights Council is a political body, and so that's why there is a lot of, not as much harsh language. The independent experts will be very, they can be very direct in their questioning of the representatives of the government. So it's usually members like ministers. Most governments will bring a delegation of, kind of, usually not the president, but like the foreign minister and sometimes it's the health minister. Depending on the issue, they'll bring a high-level delegation, and I've seen a few of them blow a gasket because of the questioning that they're getting. Get really hot under the collar. So it's a little more, in some ways it's more, you're sitting there in the, yes, but I've come to really see that we need both processes because they really do work together. Because the Human Rights Council, in the UPR process, they will reinforce the recommendations that are made by the treaty bodies. The NGO role is a little bit different too because we have a chance to brief the committee members before the review in a closed-door session. And so they ask us questions, and we're able to give them information. We use the one-pagers there as well. And many times we've seen them, reading right off the one-pager or asking them, we give them recommended questions. And so you can see it highlighted, and, that's always really, and occasionally we've had a committee member or one of their clerks email us during this actually happened in the US review. There was a death penalty question from Mississippi, and the US delegation for some reason brought the Attorney General of Mississippi, and so the committee member that was asking questions about the administration of the death penalty wanted to, some facts. So emailed us in Minneapolis, we emailed our partner organization down in Mississippi and got it back to Geneva, within like half an hour. So, and then heard the question asked. So that was pretty rewarding. In March, when we were there, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was reviewing Iran, and we were participating in that. There's very limited space in Iran for civil society voice, and so it's the diaspora voices that have to speak. So we've been working with some groups outside of Iran, and there are some provisions like having your hand cut off for stealing, things like that. That were worth bringing before the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But we had something happen that we had never had happen before, which was there was a government NGO who was following us around and trying to get into the closed-door briefings. And so Amy, my colleague, and there was one other organization, an LGBT organization. So they had to go to a secret entrance and take a secret elevator to go to the meeting. And so the Gongo is what they're called, wasn't able to follow. Yes?
You said you worked with diaspora groups, such as NIAC, or who?
So the Advocates works with a lot of different diaspora groups.
But I'm talking about Iran in particular.
Oh, yeah, no, this is specifically an anti-death penalty group in Iran. I can't remember the name, they're based in Europe, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, but they only work on death penalty abolition. Yeah. In the US, we work with, a lot of different Ethiopian, Somali, Liberian, a lot of different groups. Okay, so let's maybe go to the next slide, and I'll say just another piece of our work is with the Human Rights Council Special Procedures mandate holders. These are independent experts appointed by the Human Rights Council. And I mentioned the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty will be doing a U.S. country visit. But so there are some that are country and some that are thematic, like violence against women, extreme poverty, rights of human rights defenders, and so forth. So we usually do try to meet with those independent experts themselves when we're in Geneva, or with their staff. And so our partners, we brought our partners, actually the week before these guys were with us, we were there with a different group and had partners from India, including a woman who's under a lot of pressure. And so, you know, the opportunity to meet with the Special Rapporteur and Human Rights Defender and make them aware of her case will hopefully be really helpful when she's arrested the next time.
Those numbers in parentheses refer to the number of independent experts?
Those are the number of mandates. So for most of them, they are independent, like one person, a special rapporteur. There are a couple where they're working groups. So there's a working group on arbitrary detention, for example. Okay, so let's go on to the next thing we're going to talk about is oral statements. So one of the things we can do with our special consultative status is participate in interactive dialogues and the Human Rights Council has a very heavy agenda of talking about human rights issues around the world. And so as Mark mentioned, they were talking about the situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo when we were there. We represent clients from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we were able to put together, to write up an oral statement, and Mark was able to deliver that. I think I just answered the question I was supposed to ask Mark. Do you have anything you want to add?
No.
Okay,
I'm just going to read from the book.
Okay, so let's just show that clip. This is just a 2-minute clip.
And the statements are timed, and you can see at the front, it's counting down, and if you're still talking, and the very nice voices, and we're on, thank you very much. Now I'll recognize the country of, or the person or whomever.
They
so
turn off your microphone. No, they turn off your microphone.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks to the Human Rights Council for its ongoing concern about the human rights situation in the Democratic Republic of Congo, including recent election-related repression and increased violence by both state actors and armed groups. With the help of pro bono attorneys, the advocates for human rights provide free legal services to hundreds of asylum seekers each year. We serve many clients from the DRC who have been forced to flee the human rights abuses. Our Congolese clients have shared with us first-hand accounts that corroborate the continued violence and serious crimes, including sexual violence committed against civilians by both armed groups and state agents, including security forces and police. Our clients from the DRC share their stories of abduction, arrest, detention, interrogation, and torture, including kicking, whipping, beating with batons, rape, and prolonged deprivation of food and water. Our clients also report that the situation in the DRC has gotten much worse for those who are actively involved with opposition parties, as well as organizations working to end sexual violence and recruitment of child soldiers in the DRC. They describe threats, intimidation, arrest, detention, and restrictions on their movement in violation of their rights to peaceful assembly, opinion, and expression. The Advocates for Human Rights calls on the Human Rights Council to continue to monitor the security situation in the DRC. The international community should support justice mechanisms that ensure the investigation, prosecution, and punishment of human rights violations and serious crimes in the DRC. Further, the government of the DRC should take immediate steps to begin implementing measures from the agreement to hold elections in 2017, including releasing detained political leaders, civil society activists, and journalists. Thank you.
So we actually did about, over the 2 weeks, we did about 14 of those. So on a wide variety of topics.
ONG, by the way, is French. ONG is French for NGO.
Yeah. Okay.
Was that Eric Schwartz there just a moment ago?
No, that was Christophe Haynes, who was the special rapporteur on extrajudicial executions. So So yeah, let's go back one slide and then you can see the view from, so this is an illegal photo. You're not allowed to take any photos within the Human Rights Council room, but I think this was a volunteer who took this one. But yeah, this is where the oral statements are given. So that's the view that you have when you give an oral statement. But Mark, why don't you tell us briefly what it was like to give that oral statement?
Well, I was very nervous. I sat in the Human Rights Council and I was listening to how each of the countries were being under review. And as we got closer and closer, I got thirstier and thirstier. And before I knew it, I was out of water. And I asked Jennifer, can I go get some water? But not only did I do that, I stopped at the restroom on the way. And then I sat there and the gentleman to my left suddenly was called. And I could feel my knees start to vibrate faster and faster. And my heart was beating and I was getting pretty nervous. Then I was called. Well, Matt, who I mentioned earlier, had described an out-of-body experience, and I did not feel that. Suddenly, this calm just hit me, and I was able to deliver it. It was totally unreal. I've never felt it that way. Even at the CLE in July, I had to go up to the podium, and I was very nervous, and I was stumbling over my words, but I was able to give it. Over at the UN, just complete calmness. It was cool.
It's pretty well practiced, I think, and you can imagine that they practice giving the statements and timed it so that you don't get cut off. You want to make your final statement is there. So I was the fill-in, potentially, for Jerome, who was the fellow from South Africa. And it was at the I think it was the last day, Thursday, when we were up there. And his was in first person. He was over at the treaty bodies at Wilson, so maybe not going to make it back in time. So I just went, I read it a few times. I said, sure, I'll do it. Changing, I'm not a colored man. I don't look like, I mean, clearly changing some things, but went through it several times. And then I just went up to the woman who is in charge of all the people who are giving statements. And she kind of stands in the back of where all those people are. And she has them lined up. I just pled mercy. I said, I'm doing this. I'm not exactly sure what order I'm in. And she said, looked at it and said, you sit here and I'll tell you. But by the time, things get delayed sometimes, and it went on a little bit. And so Jerome made it, which was much more effective than having me deliver it. It was still, it would have been a good statement, but very much more, it's much better coming from his words in first person. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think another thing to think about when you think about impact of participating in these UN bodies, Tista Sedevald, who was an Indian lawyer who was with us the first week, the one who's, the government holds her passport. It was really, we weren't sure she was going to be able to join us. It was hard to get her out of India. But she gave one of the oral statements about, and the issues that she works on are the rights of religious minorities in India. And it was shared more than 45,000 times before the government of India blocked the YouTube version. So I think just one final question, and then we'll open it up for more questions. Mark, what would you tell someone who's interested in participating in a UN experience like this?
Well, I created a list, read the one-pagers, talk to each other during the session, practice the oral statements, participate, and also bring and know how to use your adapter. I blew a fuse at the hotel. Most embarrassing.
I would just say that anybody can go. Most of the participants were lawyers, but not everybody. You don't need to be a lawyer. If you're interested in this, you'll learn the process. It's not as complicated as it seemed to me when I first read all this information. You'll learn a ton, and it's mind expanding for sure.
Great. Well, thanks to you both, and we'll maybe turn it over to Dick and. Thank you.
This was marvelous. I know Mark in the context of being a quiet professional web person for our volunteer organization. And it's just so marvelous to hear the presentation tonight. We have some time for dialogue. It's about 8:15 or so, and maybe do about 15 minutes or so of back and forth, and I'll just let the panel moderate the questioners, and after that I'll once again interrupt, and I want to have John Borgen give a couple of announcements and make a little pitch for our organization as well. So I'm going to start with Michael, and then you folks can moderate, okay?
Sure. Okay.
Okay, this was a great exposition of the power of incremental change and your sustained work on many fronts, cherishing small bits of progress. I just was very inspired by this. So my question for you is, how much of this is getting down to the high school students or the college students in our country? And I'm worried because the impression that I have is that they are not aware of much of the positive side of your work or the United Nations work, but they're more aware of the criticisms of the UN in particular. So what's your impression? How much of this gets down to the...
That's a great question. How much of this information is getting down to our young people, our high school students and so forth? I'll just take one thing, and then you guys can jump in. I have 3 children. 2 of them are in high school. So I've been actually really pleased to see that the social studies standards have just recently, and this is actually something the advocates lobbied for in our state legislature, but the social studies standards now include human rights and also studying so I think, I'm trying to remember now which one of my sons, they spent 3 weeks on the UN system it must have been freshman year, maybe sophomore year of high school.
Was that a public school?
Public school, yeah. But it's part of it's the standards, so that the schools are teaching to the standards. So that makes a big difference when you change the standards. So we've actually mapped out throughout the U.S., and there are some other states like Oregon, and I haven't looked at it in a long time, so I don't remember which states in particular, but a minority of states that are that human rights education is being incorporated into the standards, and that makes a difference. Anyone want to add anything?
Yeah, the only thing I can add at all is that I have a daughter who's a 4th grade teacher in Edina, and I don't know if you've read about some of the brouhaha that's going on in Edina right now, that they're saying the test scores are going down because they're spending so much time on diversity. And she said lots of what they're saying isn't true. The test scores aren't. So, I mean, when you look at it and parse it out, that's not the case. But they do a lot of teaching on diversity and things like that. They have a lot of open enroll students, so they're getting, kids from all over. This year, I think, more than ever. So it was interesting brouhaha, because some people, of course, wanted them to just, reading, writing, arithmetic, and all of that, and forget all the others. So there is the board it's an issue for the school. But I think more people are on the side of, this is a good thing to have.
Yeah, and I should also mention, since Christy Rodelius Palmer is involved with your organization, and she's a fabulous human rights educator, there was a time when we were much more active in the schools, and we're working with Christy at the Human Rights Center. But the downside of these focus on standards is that the teachers have less flexibility. So, we had developed a lot of curricular materials on human rights, and they're still being used, but we used to have right sites projects where there were certain schools where we were doing a lot more depth on human rights, and the teachers just don't have the time anymore to do that kind. So that's disappointing. So, yes.
I have a couple of questions about human rights in the United States. And do you know who is working on these issues? One of them is the amount of sexual violence that goes in the universities and colleges, and the problem of who the colleges are dealing with it instead of being criminalized like anyone else.
The private universities.
Private universities and public universities.
Can
So
you
that is
summarize the question, please?
So the first question is about who's working on sexual violence in private universities, and the fact that they're not, they're handling it internally as opposed to through the criminal justice system.
The other one is on
You can't hear the
human. The other question is on human trafficking and what is doing like things like a Super Bowl, the amount of human trafficking that is happening right now, and who is working with this issue.
Okay. So on the first question, I really wish our women's program staff were here. I don't know who's working on the issue of sexual violence at the university. Maybe others in the group know of organizations that are working specifically on that issue. On the issue of human trafficking, I do know a little bit more. That's something that the Advocates is working on. In 2007, we published a report on sex trafficking in Minnesota, which then was the basis for the Safe Harbors Act, and we've continued to work on that. We're actually working on a project now with the Minnesota Department of Health on labor trafficking of youth, which crosses over with sex trafficking. But it sounded like your question related a little bit to the Super Bowl. There is a task force that's been quite organized for several years now. We're part of that, and the next meeting is on Monday. But the plan is a lot of training. So if I remember right, every hotel worker will have been trained in identifying sex trafficking before the Super Bowl. I know our organization is responsible, so they're kind of dividing out by sector. Our organization is responsible for training all of the emergency responders in the Twin Cities area before the Super Bowl. You want to talk about the airport?
Yeah, so I volunteer at the airport a couple days a week, like one day in customs and one day just in the mall. They just did a second round of training on trafficking, and there is a police woman who's part of the police force at the airport, which is its own police force. That's her job. She gave us her cell phone, said call me anytime. If you see anything, call the police. Otherwise, if you know, doesn't have to be sure about that, but if you see something that you think isn't right, the customs officers have all been trained, so people coming in, if they see something that's they think isn't right, they're investigating that. So there's a lot there. I mean, and it's about Super Bowl. I mean, it can be about any time, of course, but Super Bowl is just a big time for this, you know, and there's a big concern that there'll be a lot of basically girls brought into Minnesota.
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that there are spikes around sporting events, but it's less bringing girls in and more, you know, trafficking is already happening, and so increasing that too. So it's important to look at both. And we know trafficking is already happening. There are so now Ramsey, Hennepin, and Washington counties all have special units that are just handling trafficking. And in Washington County, their special crimes unit, they anticipated, when they created it, they anticipated 5 big trafficking cases, and they have 66. So, you know, once you do the identification, you know, you find, it's like picking up a rock. You find that awful things are happening. So, yes, Joe. Yeah, I shouldn't be so possessive of the microphone.
The United Nations has had a rather bad press in the United States for at least 25 years. And it's undertaught in the schools. It's something about which most Americans are woefully ignorant, although I'm glad to hear what you said about your daughter's experience in high school. And by and large, we don't understand the United Nations. One of the accusations made against it is that it's a toothless tiger, a talk shop. But we've seen here evidence that it's more than a talk shop. That what it does is create new sets of norms which don't have the force of it all, although some of them do become, over time, regarded as customary international law, and including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But you've shown here that despite the fact that the only part of the United Nations that has any binding power is the Security Council, the United Nations system, various agencies within the United Nations system exercise soft power, the power of creating norms that are obviously fair and that are well thought through and so forth, and reaching out to non-governmental organizations, which in turn reach out to their various public constituencies. So I just want to congratulate the panel for bringing up, for demonstrating that the United Nations really matters. It does.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think there's a question in the back.
I have more like a philosophical question. First of all, I truly admire your commitment and your laborious work as you've shown here. But when I think about what's happening at the White House or at Kremlin or at Beijing, I become very pessimistic. Now, in your opinion, since the United Nations was founded and the Declaration of Human Rights made, has the general condition of human rights gotten better?
Yes, I think there's no question about that. Okay. Yes, thank you for your question. There's no question in my mind that we are on the right path. You know, change is slow, but we are definitely on the right path. And there was a picture of Christoph Haynes, the former special rapporteur on extrajudicial, arbitrary, and summary executions, and he likes to point. I mean, you know, that's a serious job. You're looking at some of the worst stuff, and he likes to point out that, you know, there's actually violence is declining. The number of people being killed in police custody, you know, outside of our country is on the decline. The way that women are treated, the way that girls accessing education. There are many areas where things are like we're clearly going in the right direction. But these international standards, these treaties, even things that aren't binding, they provide best practices, kind of like a yardstick that you can measure your own country's record against. And I think that there's a real value to that. And I'll just say, last year at the Committee of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the government of Morocco was complaining about polygamy was one of the issues that we had brought up. It's against the law in Morocco, and yet by practice it still is happening, and you can get judicial authorizations. And one of the ministers who was speaking on behalf of Morocco said, well, if a woman, you know, if a man can't, or if a woman can't have sons, then of course, you know, you got to marry another woman so you can get the sons. And the chair of the committee stood up at the, you know, he closed it at the end of the session, he closed it out, and he went back to that comment and saying, this is not a Western idea, this is something that all nations in the world have agreed to in drafting this treaty and making this principle that you know, that polygamy is wrong. So Morocco doesn't get a pass on that. You know, you can't say it's just your culture, or that, you know, I mean, it's also, you know, biologically incorrect. But anyway, that was a pretty amazing thing. And I think there was one last question over.
Yeah. Well,
okay.
You know, as you know, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm ready to give a talk now. Okay. Anyway, as you know, we have the Millennium Development Goals, and now you have the Sustainability Development Goals. There's a big buzz about it all over the world, including U.S. at different levels. And generally, one thinks of it in terms of no hunger, zero poverty, you know, well-being. Although Goal 16 relates to justice and institutions, the kinds of things you're trying to promote, it's very admirable. But very rarely any of that gets talked about. You know, climate action they talk about affordable energy and so on. And I've always had this feeling that while poverty may be the root cause of many of the problems we have, the persistence of poverty is because of injustice and discrimination and everything you're working to ameliorate. Has the advocates for human, now here's the question, has the advocates of human rights thought about sort of creating a kind of a platform or education or some kind of a method by which you can tie all these things together and more or less ride the wave of, you know, all the foundations and everybody buzz on UN sustainability development goals, in particular bringing it down at school levels and so on. Anyway, that's a hope and a question.
Yeah. So we're not a development organization, but so we don't go deep into the SDGs or the MDGs, but are very pleased to see, I think the Millennium Development Goals definitely reflect more human rights principles than the SDGs did as well. That having been said, at its core, human rights is we see all rights as being interconnected and indivisible, and so the economic, social, and cultural rights, you know, if you don't have enough to eat, then how do you access your right to education or, you know, or some of the other civil and political rights. So we definitely see them all as being interconnected and look at those kind of intersectionalities, and that runs through all of our work. So even our work with representing asylum seekers. So we don't sort of pull it out and have a separate platform for that, but maybe we should think about that. But you know, we're also at a time where we're in kind of rapid response mode in our own country, and so a lot of our energy is getting pulled away into responding to the executive orders as they come out, and the fear, and there's so much fear in the community right now. So we're doing so many Know Your Rights presentations, and you know, just the demand for our legal services among our immigrant population, refugee and immigrant population has really increased as well. So, yeah, so it's a trying time. There's a lot going on, but you know, we have to keep going. So thank you all for your interest. It's, you know, it's really wonderful for me as I do this work every day to know that there are people in the community that have our back. So, so thanks.
Thank you again.